Parents and pediatricians alike love to see kids grow. But when do we worry about growth disorders? When do we seek out specialty care? Here at Children's National, we have leading endocrinologists investigating short stature. They are all working to help children achieve our motto, grow up stronger. I'm Dr. Nate Kuppermann, Chair of Pediatrics and Chief Academic Officer at Children's National. I'm a pediatric emergency physician, and I've spent 3 decades caring for acutely sick children. Endocrinology plays a big part of my life, however, because I'm married to a pediatric endocrinologist, Dr. Nicole Glazer. That's why I'm particularly excited to have the Chief of Pediatric Endocrinology at Children's National, Dr. Andrew Dauber, with me today. Andrew, welcome to the show. Before we start, and if it's okay, Dr. Dauber, I'm going to call you Andrew, and you please call me Nate. I have to share that I have a box of my favorite donuts right here. And in fact, before we get started, I need to take a little bite out of one of them because, my wife, Dr. Glazer, she's not here. And, she's kind of a purist about sugar and she doesn't like me to eat much sugar. Excuse me, I need one more bite. And what I really want to know is, donuts, they've got like holes in them, right? So like eating a box of donuts with a bunch of holes in them, doesn't that like spare me some of the caloric intake and it's okay to do every so often? What do you think about that?
I definitely think that's the case, Nate. My problem always, though, is after years in Boston, I became very partial to the Boston cream donut, and there are no holes. There's no holes. So I've always had to shy away, but I think everything in moderation.
Well, I have to say one other thing, by the way, about Boston donuts. I was raised on California donuts because I'm a California guy, but it just so happens I was living in Coolidge Corner, where that is right near Boston Children's, and on the way to the hospital, there's like 3 Dunkin' Donuts around the way. And this is not an advertisement for Dunkin' Donuts, but I just got addicted to donuts, and their coffee is actually pretty good for being a donut store.
Yeah, it is quite a Boston tradition.
Boston tradition. So anyway, but that donuts as an aside, and I promise, like after the show's over, I will send you a couple just to, tide over your appetite till dinner. But I just want to start at the beginning, Andrew, and really, I wonder if you could take us back in time. What got you into this field at the start?
I would say around 15 years ago, I was a budding pediatric endocrine fellow and learning about all different areas of endocrinology. And really, one area that I found really fascinating was kids who were coming to us for evaluation of short stature. They weren't growing well, and parents wanted to know why. And, at that time, really the only mechanism we had to think about these kids was to start measuring their hormones. And it turns out that of the kids who show up in our office, which is a very common concern for parents, that their kids aren't growing, only a really small percentage of them have a hormonal problem causing them to not grow. And this time was the same time that, the human genome had just been sequenced and all these new technologies were coming out, letting us look at the genomes of the patients in front of us. And I got hooked up with a great mentor. His name's Joel Hirschhorn. I think you know him from your time there as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And Joel was doing cutting edge research on the genomics of growth. And it really felt to me like this was an opportunity to start to answer questions for our patients to figure out, what was going on? Why were those kids not growing? Perhaps the genes might give us an answer where the hormones had not yet.
That is really fascinating. And it's like a lot of fields where there is just a handful, a subset, where there is a fundamental cause for the disorder that we need to address. Just as an aside, how do you address the multitude of parents who come into your clinic with children who are short, but there is not a genetic basis? And how do you counsel them or reassure them when there isn't that gene or something that needs a specific therapy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to reframe a little bit, I actually often think that there is a genetic basis, but it's not necessarily an abnormal genetic basis, right? And so we know that there are thousands and thousands of genes and different genetic variants that influence how tall a child's supposed to be. And most of them are common normal genetic variation that we all have, right? There are genetic changes that makes each of us different from each other. We have different color hair and different color eyes and come in all different shapes and sizes. And what I try and tell families is that most of this is just normal variation, that there are our DNA kind of is the instructions for how we're supposed to be. And there are lots of changes that make us who we are. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's any problem. Rarely we do genetic testing to find those like single gene disorders or defects where something is causing a pathological problem, where those growth plates aren't reacting normally, aren't able to grow. And those are the rare and often more severe conditions that I'm, most concerned with. But I think we have to talk with parents about what are the priorities? What do we really care about for our kids? We care that they grow up and are healthy and thriving and productive members of society. And, there are plenty of people who can do that at 5'3" 5'4", whatever the height is that they're concerned about, and really talk about, which kids do need interventions, who do not. And I spend much of my time trying to convince people that their children are healthy and they really don't need any intervention. But for those that do, it's important to figure out why.
That's, I have to comment that that is really one of the lovely aspects of being a physician, right? And specifically, of course, being a pediatrician, interacting with concerned parents where a lot of the therapy needed is really good explanations and speaking in a fashion and in a manner that they can understand and whatnot. But now let's move on to the kind of the more serious situation that is where there are like specific genetic defects that need to be addressed. And I guess for me, it leads to the question of how did you start in your research, specifically with regards to the genetic basis of certain growth defects?
I really was fortunate to be working at a time where the technology had exploded, right? There was the advent of this new technology called next generation sequencing. The details aren't important, but basically it's the technology that lets us sequence, instead of one gene at a time, all 20,000 genes in the genome at once and really look at all of them. So even as a fellow, I started recruiting a cohort of patients with what at the time was called idiopathic short stature, which means you were short and we didn't have any specific cause for it. And we started doing larger scale sequencing projects, from first doing panels of hundreds of genes and then doing whole exome and whole genome sequence where we're sequencing all 20,000 genes at once. And it was an amazing and exciting time because we started to find new genetic causes, just interesting families, interesting patients with more significant short stature. Sometimes they had associated skeletal abnormalities or other, abnormal hormonal features. And we were doing sequencing in these families, and I started to discover a number of new causes of short stature. Some of them were involved with, proteins directly in the growth plate that affected how the cells in the growth plate would grow and proliferate. Others affected the regulation of hormones and growth hormone and IGF-1s. So it was really from studying in detail individual patients and individual families and starting to figure out which families had unique clinical features. And we would go back and forth. We would look at the genetics and then we'd get some insight. We'd go back to the family and would say, hey, we need to measure this in you now. We need to measure this hormone. We need to look a little bit deeper. And we started to really put together and understand what are the features of individual genetic disorders and what does that mean for the prognosis for these kids. Are there other medical comorbidities we need to start to think about now that we understand the underlying pathophysiology?
That's fascinating. So, Andrew, everybody has an inflection point or two in their careers. How did you find yours? I mean, I can tell you one of my big inflection points is when I arrived at my new job at UC Davis, every child after trauma was getting a CAT scan, and I knew that was wrong and I had to fix that. How about you? What was your first big aha inflection point?
Sure. So there's this one family that I'd been working with. They actually, they lived in New York initially, but they got referred to me after they'd seen multiple doctors. And this family had 5 children, and 3 of the children all had very significant short stature, all well below the curve. And they had this very unique abnormality in their hormonal evaluation. Their IGF-1, which is a marker of growth hormone, was sky high, through the roof, despite being quite short. But they didn't have mutations in the IGF-1 receptor. Nobody could really figure it out. So we used this newer technology, and we were able to finally come up with the answer. They had a new disorder that had never been described before. something called PAPA2 deficiency. The details aren't important, but literally this family had been undergoing a diagnostic journey for maybe 15 years. And we got the answer. We were sure this was the right answer. I called the mother and I said, hey, we figured it out. We know what's going on in your family. Here's what's going on. This is the mutation. This is, why your kids aren't growing. And the mom's like, Dr. Dauber, that's wonderful news. Thank you. I really appreciate all of your work. It's nice that you know what's going on. But what are you going to do about it? How are you going to help my kids grow? And it was just like, boom, a light bulb went off in my head. And I was like, oh my God, that's such an important question. Of course, it's such an important question. I was so focused on figuring out what was going on that I hadn't yet figured out, well, what were we going to do? And that mom pushed me to say, like, think about how you can offer some treatment. And we did. We came up with actually 2 individual clinical trials just for this family. We tried one transfusion-based trial, which kind of partially worked. The details, again, not so important. And then we tried a targeted drug trial for this family where it did seem to help a little bit, where I wrote a protocol just for this family based on our new understanding of the physiology. And that really sparked my desire to say, like, okay, yes, we got to figure out what's going on, but then we got to figure out what can we do. And I've been trying to do that ever since with kind of precision medicine therapy for these rare genetic growth disorders.
So let me ask you kind of a follow-up question. First of all, so that was a sort of a trial of one that you did with this particular patient. Is that right? And then why don't you just kind of tell our listeners a little bit more about precision medicine and how what you're describing here is really falls right in the center of the umbrella of precision medicine.
Yeah, so let me tell you about a second trial, one that we did, because this is just a great example of precision medicine. So precision medicine is the idea of instead of taking your hammer, which could work for anything, and just knocking away at whatever problem, really trying to understand what is this individual patient's pathophysiology, like what's going on for this individual patient and how can we address it. So I had, again, a patient, this one's from North Carolina, and their physician reached out to me, and this child also was not growing and was quite short. And his father also was quite short. And after many years of evaluation, he had some genetic testing, and it found that he had one copy of a mutation in the receptor for growth hormone, the growth hormone receptor. But he had a very unique type of mutation, because typically if you have one mutation in the growth hormone receptor, but the other one's working fine, you grow okay. But there are these rare mutations that cause what's called a dominant negative effect, where the one copy messes up the other copy also, okay? And the way his was working was that part of the growth hormone receptor. So the growth hormone receptor is what growth hormone has to attach to make it work, right? And the receptor sits on the surface of cells. It has part on the outside, part through the cell wall, through the cell membrane, and then part on the inside. He had a very unique mutation that was clipping off the part on the outside, and it was hanging out in his blood and acting as a sponge and sucking up all of his growth hormone. And I had seen one other patient like this. So I had an idea. We had done some cell work in this other patient to prove that was going on, that he basically had like a sponge sucking up all his growth hormone. So I said to the mother, I'm like, you know what? I really think I understand what's going on in your son. And I have a hypothesis of how we could fix it. People, in fact, this child's father had been treated with growth hormone and it hadn't worked for him because he had been treated with a normal dose of growth hormone and the sponge was just sucking it up. And I said, I want to overwhelm the sponge. I want to give him so much growth hormone that we're going to overwhelm and then let the growth hormone start to bind to the normal receptor. And the mom's like, okay, that makes sense to me. Go for it. So what happened? Well, I got COVID. This was a few years ago, and I got COVID. And thankfully, I wasn't too sick. I had been vaccinated, but I was home, and I couldn't come to work for a week. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to sit in my office at home, and I'm going to write a protocol for this kid. And because we're going to use a dose of growth hormone that never has been used before, I needed to get permission from the FDA. So I wrote what's called an IND, an investigational new drug application to the FDA for this one child. And then we had to get the growth hormones. Growth hormones pretty expensive. So I wrote a grant to Pfizer. I said, listen, I'm not asking for money. I just need you to give me a boatload of growth hormone for this kid. And they said yes. So did all of that in this week, sent it off, and we got approval. The IRB got approved. FDA, after a few minor modifications, said go for it. And what we decided was I was going to start at a high dose of growth hormone. And then every 2 weeks, we were basically going to like double the dose. We're going to go to 50 to 100 to 150 to 200 to 150 doses that have never been used in humans before, right? And we were going to monitor a marker of his growth hormone action until I could get that into the normal range. And lo and behold, when we got to that top dose, like 5 times the usual high dose that's used, all of a sudden the marker showed us, his IGF-1 came up, it showed us that we were overwhelming that sponge. It was working. And he's now been on this high dose for 2 years, and his growth chart, it's like this. It's like a hockey stick. He's he's coming up to the normal growth curve, on the growth curve, and he looks like a totally different kid. And the family is just ecstatic that we've been able to figure out what's going on and really, help him grow up stronger, as we say here at Children's National.
Exactly. By the way, so two things. First of all, I want you to tell us all how long will he need to be on that, and is there any growth hormone left for everybody else?
So that's a great question. It's unbelievable what happens. So he's going to need to be on this now until he's done growing. So he'll probably in total be on this medicine for maybe 7 years or so. It's been, as I said, 2 years now. So, thanks to the generosity of Pfizer, they're continuing to support the growth hormone for free. But he uses an entire 12 milligram cartridge of growth hormone pen in less than 2 days, right? Normally this lasts people like a month, and he uses a whole one. So every time he comes, we have to give him like 100 cartridges, to get him through. And it's so much his daily dose that it can't even fit in one injection. He has to give multiple injections a day, but he's happy to do it because they see the results and they see that it's working. So it's pretty amazing.
So, what you're describing to me, Andrew, and what we're trying to highlight in this show is the importance of not only clinical care, which I put in here my left hand, but the importance of science and research that really informs our clinical care so that we can ensure that the care that we're providing to our patients here is absolutely at the leading edge. And you can't do that without doing the research. So, really, the stories that you've provided are really great examples of that.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. Like I think that there are a number of examples of that. Like all of the time, patients get genetic test results, let's say, or any test results, and the interpretation says, well, clinical correlation is required, right? Like, is this real? Is this not? How much of an influence? And sometimes we can't answer that question without going to the lab, without doing some basic research to really understand it. And then on the flip side, you know, all the time I hear about patients who say, oh, maybe we figured out an answer, maybe we didn't, but then my doctor said, I don't have anything else to offer in clinical care. Like, that's it, we're done. You know, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And like, to me, that's so dissatisfying. And that's where research has to come in, right? You need people who are like thinking of new ideas, who are willing to try something, who are willing to go out on a limb and say, like, no, we need to write a protocol for you, for your kid, and we need to try something new and different. And because it's new, because it's different, we need to study it, right? We need to do it in a safe way, and we need to, have our researchers really involved to come up with those new options for patients. So I agree, and Children's National really has everything it needs to make that happen, which is really exciting. Why I love working here.
I would like to ask you about other ongoing research that you're doing, the vosoritide trial, and perhaps anything else you want to talk about. What's ahead?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, the vosoritide trials are really exciting, also precision medicine trials. So, for many years, growth hormone was our real only option for kids who weren't growing well. And like I said, it was the hammer and nail. Everything looked the same. We just tried to hit it with the hammer. But recently, this new medicine's been developed. It's called vosoritide. And what vosoritide is, it's a different mechanism. It's what's called a C-type natriuretic peptide analog. Again, the detail's not so important, but it hits a different pathway in the cells in the growth plate, directly stimulating them to grow and make the bones go longer. Now, this drug was developed for achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism, because it affects kind of a pathway downstream. But when this gets back to my sequencing days, I started to find patients with that idiopathic short stature who had mutations in all different parts of those pathways downstream, including in the receptor for this drug, right? So I contacted the drug's made by a company called BioMarin. I contacted them and actually surreptitiously met with one of their executives in the lobby of a consensus conference meeting in Lisbon that I was speaking at. Anyway, a longer story, we had a chat and I said, you know what? Understanding the biology, I think that there are these other growth disorders where this medicine could really be an exact precision medicine, right? It could target the exact pathways that's affected by these other genetic growth disorders. And I want to do a trial for this. And, they said, we're interested. Come out, talk to us. And Nate, you'll love this. This is a real East Coast, West Coast story. I know you spent much in the West Coast. I went out to their headquarters in the Bay Area, right? Prepared with my presentation. And I'm as East Coast as they come, right? I came out there, I had my gray suit, my tie, maybe my wingtip shoes on. I was all prepared, right? And I walk into the office there and I look like a total fish out of water, right? They're all there with their colorful shirts, a few buttons open, maybe some chest hair showing. It was, they were like, look at this guy in his suit. It kind of looked funny, but we had a great conversation and they greenlit the project. Again, I applied to the FDA for an IND. Again, after some conversation and refinement, we got it approved. And now we're the only site in the world that has been offering this medication for these other selected genetic causes of short stature, for hypochondroplasia, for rhasopathies like Noonan syndrome, and for mutations in these genes, NPR2 and aggrecan, which affect that pathway. And, some of the results we published, some are still ongoing, but we're really seeing some amazingly exciting results in individual patients where we're hitting their exact pathway and they're growing absolutely beautifully. So starting to kind of understand the physiology, starting to open up new options for patients. And we've had patients come from all over the world to Children's National to be part of this study. Literally, we have patients from Russia, Argentina, Brazil, Panama, Croatia, the UK. I'm sure I'm missing other places just in the last few years who have come to America and actually have had to move here to be part of this trial, to get access to this new drug because nowhere else in the world has this opportunity. So it's really been amazingly gratifying to be able to try something new and help these kids and see positive results for them.
That's fabulous. So, Andrew, as we kind of get to the close of this podcast, what I'd like to know is what do you see as the future in research in your field here at Children's National? What is ahead for us here?
So we're doing a whole bunch of different things. So that trial is still ongoing. We're extending it. And what I've really been excited about is that it's pushed BioMarin now to do their own now phase 3 trial in hypochondroplasia as they're going to try and get approval for this medicine in that condition. So we're a lead site for that trial. We're involved with some other kind of industry trials. We're also doing some biomarker studies, so I'm sure, like waiting to see if a kid's growing can take 6 to 12 months to see if your medicine's affecting it. So working with one of my fabulous fellows, we're doing a biomarker study where we look at one of the collagen proteins that's clipped off as bones get longer. And we're trying to see if we can see quick changes in that and see if that predicts people's response to therapy. So I'm excited that study's kind of halfway done. So that's another thing that we're doing. We've created a multidisciplinary growth clinic here with our genetics team and with one of my colleagues, Dr. Yoonhee Ji, who's doing a lot of also genome sequencing in kids with unknown growth problems. So a lot of exciting things going on in our growth center here at Children's National.
Before I do a quick summary, I'm just going to share a little story that's like the counter story. When I went to Boston Children's for my fellowship, and it's, where I met Nicole, my wife, whom I was a California guy. I came from Los Angeles, and I came like this, no tie, California looking jacket, whatnot, and at this formal place. And And, my first few weeks, they were just a little rocky because, the culture was a little bit different. And then I overheard someone saying, yeah, that's what happens when you bring people in from outside the system. But anyway, then I, of course, made my way into the system and, became chief fellow and whatnot and became part of that Boston culture. But it is funny how, like, we have to break into different cultures from the East and West, just like you were saying. But what I heard you say today, and all super important. So, growth disorders or growth conditions in children are fairly common, and they obviously cause concern to parents. Parents really want to see their children grow. What you're describing is that historically there was sort of just, the hammer treatment. You just kind of threw a kitchen sink at certain disorders pertaining to growth. But now in the modern era of medicine, you've been able to identify specific genetic markers of disease, as well as certain genes responsible for disease, that you can now target therapies, whether it's gene therapy or therapies that target receptors for proteins, whatnot. So it's really entered the era of precision medicine, giving parents of children with genetic basis of serious disease hope for the future with the modern precision medicine approach. Is that a fair summary of what you've described to us today?
Yeah, that's an excellent summary. And I think there's a lot of hope on the horizon. I think that there are a lot of new drugs being developed. Our understanding just increases every day. So there's lots to be optimistic about.
I just want to, close by telling our listeners, first of all, to thank everyone for joining us in the Lead in Peds. Today, it was Dr. Andrew Dauber, the Lead in Peds, and for following us. And, with each episode, we're trying to describe the importance and the impact of the great science being done here at Children's National and how it impacts and is inextricably linked with the outstanding clinical care being delivered here. And you can go to wherever you get your podcasts and you'll see episodes on the continuum of pediatric cardiology, from fetal cardiology through adolescence. We have episodes on addiction medicine and others. So thank you for joining and looking forward to the next episode of The Lead in Peds. Please subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts and learn about what we're doing to raise the bar of care for all children here at Children's National and around the world.